Welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast from Blick Rothenberg, the tax accounting and business advisory firm. This week with Nimesh, Shah and Malli, Kini.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast. I'm Nimesh Shah, CEO of Blick Rothenberg, and it was great to hear a new voice last week, Gabby Donald, on her first visit to The Tax Factor. So learned listeners of The Tax Factor may recall Gabby talked about VAT on private school fees. And if that wasn't enough for you, there is a briefing note on VAT on private school fees that's available on our website. So I can see the clamour of people already running over to the Blick Rothenberg website to access Gabby's note on VAT on school fees. Unfortunately, there is no way to get out of that 20%. Talking of new voices, I am delighted to welcome another new guest to our team at The Tax Factor, Malli Kini, partner in our private client team and lead on entrepreneurs. Welcome, Malli, to The Tax Factor.
Thank you for having me, Nimesh.
So, Malli, we're not going to talk too much, actually, about your love of entrepreneurs on this episode, but we've picked out a couple of stories, haven't we, that we were talking about earlier today, about getting on the wrong side of HMRC. And to kick us off, you spotted, and I don't think it escaped anyone's attention, really, because this has been all over the broadsheet newspapers, but Ron Weasley of Harry Potter fame has got himself into a spot of bother with HMRC. What happened on this tax case? Was it as serious as the Times made it out to be?
Well, it's a fascinating story, and it sort of relates to an old clause, so an anti-avoidance clause called the Beatles clause, which I'll get into. But yes, you're absolutely right. This is a story about Rupert Grint, Ron Weasley from the Harry Potter films, who's been hit with a 1.8 million tax bill. So if we break that down, so back in 2011, Rupert set up a company called Clade 10 Limited. He was the sole shareholder, and his dad ran the company as a director. Through the company, Rupert transferred the rights, for future royalties, records and goodwill linked to his acting career for about 4.5 million. And so the idea was that the disposal to the company would be treated as a capital gain, so taxed at a lower 10% tax rate using entrepreneurs relief, which is obviously very topical right now and post-budget. HMRC have argued that the 4.5 million wasn't really a capital gain. Instead, they claimed it should be treated as income, meaning it would be taxed at a much higher rate of income tax, which back in 2011 was actually a higher rate of 50% than the 45% that we have right now. So what's happened now? Well, HMRC's opened an investigation 2011 tax return. The case finally landed in the front of the tax tribunal, where Rupert's team argued that the arrangement wasn't about avoiding income tax. It was just a legitimate business setup. But the judge didn't agree. They ruled that the payment Rupert received for his rights, records and goodwill was essentially income tied back to his acting work and should be taxed as such. And sort of, as I said, this is quite an interesting case as it brought into focus a piece of targeted sort of anti-avoidance legislation. It's a bit more detailed, but sort of 778 and 779 of the Income Tax Act, where arrangements like this essentially attempt to convert income into capital. And this clause was actually introduced by the taxmen after the Beatles did something similar, and hence it's known as the Beatles clause. And also it was at the time where they released their record Taxman. So very interesting in that sense. So what does it all mean? Well, for Rupert, it's been an expensive lesson in tax law. And for everyone else, it's a reminder that if you're structuring your finances in a creative way, you need to be sure it can stand up in scrutiny from HMRC. As you know, Nimesh, tax law is tricky, especially when big sums are involved.
Yeah, it was an interesting bit of planning, as you said, Malli, from Rupert Grint and his advisors. Intuitively, you think, actually, hey presto, I've managed to take something from my acting and my brand as Rupert Grint, Ron Weasley in the Harry Potter films, and convert it from income, taxable at the higher rates, and national insurance into CGT. That sounds wonderful. We'd all love to go and do that. And back then, Rupert Grint managed to claim that 10% entrepreneurs relief up to 10 million, as you talked about. So it sounded like a really neat bit of planning, but as you said, there's some anti-avoidance in there, and HMRC got on top of it. What I don't know, and I haven't actually looked at the case in great detail yet, is whether this will be now appealed by Rupert Grint and his advisors, but it seems like HMRC have hung their hat on that bit of anti-avoidance, so it feels like he's not going to be able to appeal that tax bill. And as you say, it's a very expensive, costly bit of planning here. Let's see if something else comes out about it. Not so high profile, but another win for HMRC, which caught my eye, Malli. And this was an article I came across around HMRC tracking down quite a notorious VAT fraudster after he paid for an £18 kebab kebab in Wales. Now, that doesn't sound very glamorous, but actually the tax at stake here was well over 250,000. So this individual had been avoiding HMRC for some years. They found it difficult to track him down, and using some of their very clever investigative powers, I think this was very clever actually, they found that this individual was residing in a bedsit around half a mile from the restaurant where he clearly made a purchase on his credit card for said kebab. And the investigators found him and tracked him down for that VAT. An unbelievable, I suppose, sequence of events here, that something as innocent as going out for dinner for a kebab has put this individual in such hot water with HMRC, and they've managed to track him down. I mean, I think for me, it shows that HMRC can be really sophisticated in their investigative powers when they want to be, and they can track down these individuals using some of the tools that are available to them. There is no hiding from the taxman, as the Beatles may have sung about. So people that haven't been able to hide from the taxman is the people that have made their way onto the list of deliberate tax defaulters, not a list that you want to be on. And HMRC have published their latest list. Malli, you've been going through the list with some interest. Anything caught your eye on the latest list?
Before I go into that, Nimesh, first of all, £18 for a kebab in Wales, that's super expensive. That's inflation gone awry there, hasn't it? So
it would have been some kebab.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. So HMRC have recently published their list of deliberate tax defaulters. The details are published by HMRC. It can name and shame people and businesses who've been given financial penalties for failing to comply with tax obligations or deliberately filing errors in tax returns. And they sort of refresh this list, I think, every 3 months. So HMRC routinely releases this information for those who made at least one deliberate default on more than 25,000. So that's actually quite a low threshold. So it can capture quite a lot of people. So it's interesting. I couldn't see any big names, Nimesh. No Rupert Grints on there. But the liabilities do range from over 5 million with penalties of almost 4 million for construction businesses. Like that one specifically was in London, all the way down to a barber's with a 26k bill and 15,000 of penalties. It is interesting to see the various sectors which look to be actually primarily in real estate or linked to real estate, as well as sole traders and sort of retail. So you kind of get the feeling that it might be a lot of areas with cash businesses potentially, and obviously the typical areas where VAT is comes into focus.
Yeah, and there's some big numbers on that list, isn't there, Malli? The one that is the top of the list was tax of over 5 million and a penalty of 3.6 million. That is some haul for HMRC. And you're right, I've been looking at the list for some years now when it comes out, and just to see if I can spot anyone that I might know that's in the public eye. It's a list that you really don't want to be on. And I think with going back to what we were saying about Rupert Grint and how that's made the papers, the list of deliberate tax defaulters on HMRC's list, in the world when reputation means a lot, if you're working especially in regulated industries like ours, financial services, we deal with a lot of financial services professionals here at Blick Rothenberg, you really don't want to appear on that list, because actually it can be career ending for you if you do end up being on there. And the threshold, as you say, is really low. It doesn't take much to get onto that list if HMRC want to publish and name and shame you. So I think, again, for me, it's not just about paying the right tax. It's making sure you do it on time, making sure that you're compliant, making sure you're doing the good things that HMRC expect you to do, because small amounts, relatively small amounts, can actually be really, really costly if you do end up appearing on that list. And in some cases, you are then precluded from actually running your profession. If your regulator requires you to have a good tax record, it's not something you want to be shown up on.
Absolutely, Nimesh. And I think you'll probably know this better, but on prior lists, we've had MPs on there, for example. So absolutely, reputation is everything.
And because reputation is everything, there is a case that's been going through the upper tribunal where the taxpayer has asked for anonymity. Now, I'm absolutely intrigued as to who this individual might be, and we're probably going to find out pretty soon, because the upper tribunal has refused the right to anonymity. Now, maybe there's a grace period here for this particular taxpayer, but this case is going to remain anonymised until the time limit for making an appeal expires or the permission for an appeal is refused. So at that point, the decision will be republished to include the name of this applicant. We don't know any more right now about what that relates to, but you can see that this individual has gone to great lengths, going right the way to the upper tribunal to protect their identity. So it'll be fascinating to see when that comes out. finally away from HMRC. And I thought to myself, we wouldn't talk about the budget today on the tax factor because our esteemed colleagues gone by over the last few weeks have done nothing but talk about the budget. So I'm going to have to put £1 in the tax factor swear jar for this. But I couldn't get away from the autumn budget on this week's episode, Malli. And it still rumbles on. I'm amazed. I've never seen a budget that over a month after the event, the noise is still carrying on with angry farmers, businesses who are really concerned about the IHT changes, concerned about national insurance increases, very, very vocal around pensions and IHT as well. Some horror stories out there about what people are doing with their pensions. Do you think that the government are going to cave into the pressure?
I think logically, you would think that with all the sort of political capital that they're expending on something which doesn't really raise very much, you think that they would make some concessions. But that we're hearing, especially from Keir Starmer, is that they are steadfast going to stick with what they've already laid down, especially with APR and even with all the pressure with the farmers, which is quite surprising. Because I think from their standpoint, if they were to concede on the APR, then obviously they'd want to BPR as well. So I think they're in a very, very tough spot.
Yeah, and Rachel Reeves has come out almost twice in the last week and said there will be no more tax changes in the remainder of this parliament. She hasn't quite said it in those words, but I'm not sure I quite believe her. I think there will be some tax changes as we get through the parliament. And if things don't quite come off on growth and the economy moving in the right direction, I can see that Rachel Reeves will have to go cap in hand back to the public for more tax revenue. So I think we're still going to have lots to talk about on the tax factor with Rachel Reeves, future budgets. I don't think me and the rest of our colleagues are going to get away from that quite yet. But I say fascinating that this budget continues to dominate headlines and continue the noise over a month in. People just won't let go of it. I can see good reason why.
The Tax Factor from Blick Rothenberg.
That is all the time we have. My thanks to Malli for joining me today. We didn't get to talk too much about entrepreneurs. We did get to talk about staying on the right side of HMRC or some of the cases being on the wrong side of HMRC. I've just got enough time to talk about a new episode of our outstanding documentary series, episode 6 of Success Stories. And this is about an entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial business, I should say. In this episode, our audit, accounting and outsourcing partner, Shah, talks with John Pickering and Helen Pyman of Malli. It's a fascinating journey about Malli's 125-year growth story and the challenges Malli has faced, particularly over the last few years. It's a great film, and as well as this episode, all previous episodes are also available on the Blick Rothenberg website or on the Blick Rothenberg YouTube channel. I recorded 2 episodes myself with Rob Small from Miniclip and Ben Branson from Seedlip, which are also an excellent watch, dare I say it myself.
We release a new episode of The Tax Factor every Friday on the Blick Rothenberg website and all the usual podcast platforms, so you can listen wherever is most convenient. We record and release them in less than 24 hours, so you always get the very latest news and updates. Next week, it's Roger Holman and Neil Insall.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Tax Factor, please subscribe and give us a rating or review, ideally 5 stars, please. I'm Nimesh Shah. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with our year-end roundup with seasoned Tax Factor veteran Heather Self. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Have a great weekend.
Goodbye.
That's The Tax Factor. We'd like to thank you for making us one of the UK's top 20 podcasts. Find all our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And join us again next time on The Tax Factor.